Hey there folks. In a recent video, I compared Washington state regulations and fishing license costs to other states and to other countries around the world. And invariably, in the hyper-partisan, toxic, highly polarized nature of American politics, I got tons of comments down below that were like, that's what you get for living in a liberal state. And there were several folks who sort of expressed that sentiment. And it really made me wonder, is this claim actually true? It's something that I hear constantly. And I just thought, well, I'll just take a basic statistical approach to answer this question. Is it actually more expensive to buy fishing licenses in liberal states? So what I did is I sat down and I went through all 50 states' regulation booklets and looked at the cost of their licenses. And sometimes they had these attached fees and such that you had to have in order to fish. So it's a little bit complicated, but one of the first things I wanted to do is I wanted to standardize my approach. That is, not all states have the same diversity of fisheries. So what I wanted to do is just do freshwater fishing licenses only. So that's the only thing I looked at was the annual freshwater fishing license cost for a resident in all the 50 states. Now there are 3 states that don't allow you to split your freshwater and saltwater licenses, and that was North Carolina, Alaska, and California. You just have to buy a one catch-all license. So throwing those in the mix probably skews the data a bit, but it's the best that I could do given what I had. And what I found is that nationally, the average cost for a resident annual freshwater fishing license was $26.94. In Washington state here, it's just a little bit over $30, so we're pretty close to the national average. But I did see some trends in the data when I was going through there. Additionally, there are 9 states that have what I call these nickel and dime fees. These are fees like a habitat conservation stamp or something like that. They usually have some sort of name like that. You have to have that in order to fish. I don't know why they don't just lump the cost of that into the fishing license, because if you have to have it in order to get a fishing license, you might as well just charge that amount. But there's a lot of states that do it, 9 of them. Those fees range anywhere from $1 to $12, depending on the state. So I included those in the cost because you literally had to have them in order to go fishing. Now, one of the first things that jumped out to me when I was looking at this data, and it was also true in the comment section on that video, is a lot of the folks from the eastern United States, a lot of my followers were saying, geez, your licenses sure seem expensive out there in Washington state. And when I started entering the data, I noticed this divide as well. So when I divided the country up of east of the Continental Divide and west of the Continental Divide states, there was a pretty significant difference. And I used a statistical test called a t-test. A t-test is used to compare the means or averages of 2 different groups. And what I found is that, yes, it is in fact true that states east of the Continental Divide have significantly cheaper licenses by about $10. So we're paying quite a bit more here in the West for our fishing licenses. And so when we run these statistical tests, and you're going to see this come up throughout this video, we get a p-value. That's the significance value. And generally, we want to see a p-value of less than 0.05. That means there's essentially, in a nutshell, there's a very small probability that the differences that we are seeing aren't real, right? So if it had a really high p-value, then that would suggest closer to 1, and that would suggest that we could be drawing the wrong conclusion because of the variability in the data, and that they in fact could just be the same, we just can't tell the difference. But when that p-value drops below 0.05, that's sort of the boundary at which we say things are significantly different. So yes, it is true. It is cheaper to buy fishing licenses in the eastern United States versus the West. And I want to come back to that later in this video because I think I have an explanation as to why. So let's jump into the politics side of this question. And so what I did is I came at this 2 different ways. I looked at the cost of an annual freshwater fishing license for a resident in states that voted for Trump versus Biden in the 2020 election. And I also looked at it for their current governor, whether or not they belong to the Democratic or Republican Party as a measure too, because there's a little bit of differences there, but not much. They are very similar. And what I found when I looked at the Trump versus Biden data is that there really isn't that big a difference. It's 24 bucks and some change in the Trump states and 27 bucks and some change in the Biden states. And when I ran the t-test, the p-value came out way above 0.05. It's closer to 0.3, which tells me that there is no real difference between so-called liberal states and conservative states, at least as judged by the 2020 election. And when I ran the same test again with Republican governors versus Democratic governor states, it was exactly the same numbers and exactly the same p-value, almost no significant difference. So the claim that it's more expensive to buy a fishing license in a liberal state is actually unequivocally false, which I'm not shocked, right? There's a ton of variability in how states manage their resources, and I suspect the cost of a fishing license is not some part of greater conspiracy by liberals to eliminate fishing opportunity. So what I really wanted to do is, well, what does explain some of these differences that I did observe? So to answer some of these questions, I use an approach called regression. And regression looks at the relationship between certain variables and another variable and tells you how strong it is, how much of it is explained, how much of the variation is explained. And so what I looked at was the cost of fishing licenses relative to a state's size. It's hard to get like surface area of water measurements for state because of streams and streamlets and beaver ponds and coastlines. Makes it really complicated. So I just used total area of a state as a proxy for opportunity. Some states are drier and some states are wetter, and so there's going to be some variability in that. But I still thought it might be a good rough approximate measure. And it turns out, I think because of that variability, area of a state doesn't really strongly predict the cost of a fishing license. So the R-square value, R-square, it tells you what percentage of that variation is explained by that variable. Less than 1% of the variation in fishing licenses is explained by the state's size. So that falls out, and the p-value was way above 0.05, it was 0.39. Then the next variable I looked at was population. And this one did actually come out significant with a point value below 0.05, it was 0.01. And it had an R-square value of 9%. So we're not talking like really strong correlation, but there is a positive correlation that as a state's population goes up in size, the cost of a fishing license there goes up as well. Next, I looked at the relationship between fishing license cost and median income, and here I found an even stronger relationship with an R-square value of 12%. So 12% of the variation is explained by median income and had a significant p-value as well. So basically what I found is that states that are wealthier and have more people are charging slightly more for their fishing licenses than states of low population density and lower income. In fact, there are some states like North Carolina, if you're on welfare, your fishing license is free. There are also states that provide free opportunities for fishing, like free fishing days and free fishing areas. Like California, you can fish from ocean piers for free without a fishing license. And some other states, like Wisconsin, will discount your first year fishing license to just $5 if you're a resident in your first year. And virtually all states have some sort of discount for seniors and veterans and active military duty. So that seemed to be fairly common throughout the entire US. So now I want to hop back to that original topic I brought up at the beginning of the video where I was talking about East versus West and why Western states seem more expensive. And it got me thinking because I've done a lot of fishing in the Great Lakes area and New England, and every time I go there, I'm always reminded how different it is from their approach to trout fisheries, because here in the West, in every state in the West, when you go fishing, you buy a fishing license, you can just go fish for trout. You don't have to pay anything extra. But when you go to any of those Great Lakes, New England states, Midwest states, you have to buy a trout tag. There's very few states there that don't require you to have some sort of stamp or certification or something to go fish for trout legally. So this is the thing. Trout fisheries are expensive because they're hatchery dependent. And so you go to a lot of those states out there, you're going to be paying another $7, $10, $15 for the opportunity to go trout. There's not a single state in the Western United States that requires you to have a trout stamp. The one exception being New Mexico, which requires a Gila trout stamp if you're going to fish for Gila trout, and it costs $0. It's just a way to measure how many people are participating in that fishery. So when you look at the differences between the states I have in yellow here, which have really active trout hatchery stocking programs in the east, versus the west, which I have in green here, a normal annual fishing license without a trout stamp is $24 in the east versus $37 in the west. But when you get an average, when you have to add in trout stamps for all of those states, all of a sudden it's $32 versus $37. So I think the big discrepancy here is that in the West, we have to finance trout hatchery production in order to sustain our fisheries and provide opportunity. We just incorporate those costs directly into our fishing licenses without having people to pay for a stamp to do it, because it is the primary fishing opportunities in much of the inland parts of the West. Whereas in the East, they have a diversity of fisheries. Not everybody is participating in trout fisheries, so they only charge people who are actually participating in trout fisheries for trout production. And that actually seems fair and to everybody involved. So I think that's the primary difference we're seeing. But the main thing I wanted to take away from this video is that I really feel like coming at this liberal versus conservative issues in fishing and hunting is really not a healthy approach to things, and it doesn't help that people are just making things up. I know sportsmen and sportswomen on both sides of the aisle and on extremes and in the middle, and the only way we're going to achieve what we want in terms of objectives from our fish and game commissions and from our wildlife and fish departments is that we come together on a collective voice on things. Instead of dividing ourselves down the lines here, we should be looking for commonalities, and we should also not just be making things up. I think we could go a long way in terms of having civil discussion if people just stopped making things up. It would make life so much easier. But I guess that's just the nature of the way things are. I will never make things up. I will say I have an opinion on things, but I will always question everything, and I am always willing to dig into the data to find the truth. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Just remember, fish smarter, not harder.